Deep in the Nevada desert, Sarah Mitchell's husband betrays her in the worst way possible, leaving her to die under the scorching sun. No water, no shelter, no help for miles around. Just when it seems all hope is lost, Jake Harrison, a lone cowboy, spots something unusual from his horse. Following tracks in the sand, he finds Sarah barely alive. Jake hasn't spoken to another soul in years, preferring the company of horses and the wide-open range, but something about Sarah's fighting spirit touches his heart, and he takes her back to his cabin to recover. As the days pass, Sarah notices Jake's gentle way with horses, matches his kind heart, though his eyes carry a sadness she longs to understand. What drove this cowboy to turn his back on the world, and will Sarah be the one to finally break down his walls? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Nevada sky in shades of amber when James Mitchell suggested they take a drive. Sarah remembered how his smile seemed different that day, tight around the edges, never quite reaching his eyes. She'd grabbed her silk scarf, the one he'd given her for their 15th anniversary, wrapping it around her neck despite the growing heat. "Let's take the scenic route," he'd said, turning off the main highway onto a dusty road she didn't recognize. "I want to show you something special." The empty water bottle rolled across the truck's floor mat now, mocking her with its hollow plastic rattle. She should have known something was wrong when he'd insisted on bringing only one bottle for their short drive. James had always been methodical, planning everything down to the smallest detail. 20 years, he said finally, breaking the heavy silence that had settled between them. They were miles from anywhere, red rock formations rising like ancient guardians around them. 20 years, and you never knew. Sarah turned to face him, noting how his knuckles had gone white against the steering wheel. Knew what? About Karen? He spoke the name softly, almost reverently. My assistant. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Karen, the young woman who joined his real estate firm 2 years ago. Sarah had even invited her to their Christmas party last December. "We're moving to California together," James continued, his voice eerily calm. "The divorce papers are already drawn up. You'll be well provided for, of course." The truck lurched to a stop, dust billowing around them like a shroud. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, her body operating on instinct rather than thought. "Don't make this difficult," James said, stepping out into the heat. "I've thought it all through. You're strong. You'll rebuild." Sarah stumbled from the truck, her designer sandals sinking into the soft sand. "James, please. Whatever this is, we can talk about it." He walked around to her side, and for a moment she thought he might embrace her. Instead, he reached for her purse, still sitting on the passenger seat. With mechanical precision, he removed her cell phone, her wallet, everything except her driver's license. "You always said you wanted an adventure," he said, backing away. "Think of this as a fresh start." The truck's engine roared to life. Sarah lunged forward, but her feet slipped in the sand. Her wedding ring caught the sunlight as she reached out, the gold band that had once symbolized forever now feeling like a brand against her skin. "Someone else can have what's left of you," James called through the open window, and then he was gone, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and the empty water bottle that had tumbled from the truck. Sarah stood frozen, the desert silence pressing in around her. 20 years of marriage disappeared into the horizon with the truck's fading silhouette. The sun climbed higher, and her silk scarf offered little protection against its merciless glare. She looked down at her wedding ring, the diamond catching fire in the sunlight. With trembling fingers, she pulled it off and let it fall into the sand. It disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by the desert that would soon try to claim her. 2. The first step was the hardest. Then another and another, her sandals leaving delicate prints in the sand. She didn't know which direction led to safety, but she knew staying still meant death. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast ocean of sand and stone that held no mercy for the betrayed or the abandoned. As she walked, Sarah's mind raced through the signs she'd missed. The late nights at the office, the new cologne, the way he'd started password protecting his phone. She'd dismissed each red flag, choosing trust over suspicion. Now that trust was burning away under the desert sun, leaving nothing but the raw truth of her situation. The empty water bottle had been deliberate, one final cruelty in a carefully orchestrated abandonment. James had always been thorough in his planning, whether it was real estate deals or apparently disposing of an unwanted wife. The sun climbed higher, transforming the desert into a shimmering furnace. Sarah's silk scarf, now damp with sweat, offered little protection against the relentless heat. She'd torn it in half, wrapping one piece around her head and using the other to cover her exposed shoulders. Her designer sandals, worse than useless in the shifting sand, dangled from her fingers as she walked barefoot, each step a lesson in endurance. The first signs of trouble came with the dizziness. The world tilted and swayed, desert scrub brush dancing like exotic creatures in the heat waves. Sarah had watched enough survival shows with James to know she needed shade, but the sparse vegetation offered little shelter from the sun's assault. A memory surfaced, a documentary about desert survival. "Walk downhill," the expert had said. "Water flows downward. Follow the path it would take." She squinted at the terrain, trying to make sense of the landscape through increasingly blurry vision. Red rocks rose in the distance, their ancient faces promising at least the possibility of shade. Sarah oriented herself toward them, using her torn scarf to mark her path by tying strips to the occasional scrub brush. If someone came looking, they'd find her trail. If someone came looking, the thought of James sent a wave of nausea through her that had nothing to do with the heat. 20 years together, and he'd planned her death with the same precision he used to close real estate deals. The desert would erase her, and he'd play the grieving husband while building his new life. With Karen. "No," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst. "Not like this." The rock seemed to move further away with each step, like a mirage taunting her with false hope. Sarah's world narrowed to the rhythm of her feet against the sand. Step, drag, step, drag. Her lips cracked and bled, and her throat felt like she'd swallowed ground glass. When the first hallucination came, it appeared as a shimmering pool of water just beyond the next rise. Sarah knew it wasn't real. The rational part of her mind screamed it couldn't be real, but her body lurched forward anyway, hope overriding logic. The mirage retreated like a cruel dance partner, always just out of reach. The sun began its slow descent, and with it came the first hint of relief from the brutal heat. But Sarah knew enough to understand that the desert nights held their own dangers. Already the temperature was dropping, and her sweat-soaked clothes would soon become a liability. She reached the red rocks just as the sun touched the horizon. The shallow cave she found barely deserved the name, but it offered shelter and a chance to rest her battered body. Inside, the temperature difference was immediate. Sarah pressed her back against the cool stone, sliding down until she sat in the sand. In the growing darkness, reality crashed over her in waves. She was going to die here, alone in this indifferent landscape. Her body would become another desert secret, hidden among the rocks and sand, until there was nothing left but sun-bleached bones. No, the word came again, stronger this time. Sarah Mitchell had spent 20 years being the perfect wife, supporting James's ambitions, hosting his business dinners, decorating their showcase home. She'd given up her own dreams of traveling, of writing, of adventure, all for him. She'd survived that slow death of self. She would survive this too. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah tore another strip from her scarf. She tied it to a scraggly bush near the cave's entrance, the pale silk catching what little light remained. Then she began gathering what she could find. Dry brush for a signal fire if she saw headlights, rocks she could use to spell out SOS, anything that might help her survive until morning. The desert night wrapped around her like a cold shroud. But in her heart, a spark of defiance burned. James had underestimated her, had expected her to lie down and die. But with each passing hour, as she huddled in her meager shelter, Sarah felt something new emerging from the ashes of her old life. Something harder, stronger, forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival. She would live. If only to spite him, she would live. Jake Harrison started his morning like any other, riding the boundary of his land as the sun crept over the horizon. His horse, Buck, moved with practiced ease through the familiar terrain, hooves kicking up small clouds of dust in the cool morning air. From his saddlebag, Jake pulled out his grandfather's old brass spyglass, a habit born of 15 years scanning these hills for strays and trespassers. The first sign that something was different came when Buck's ears twitched forward. His stride, faltering slightly, Jake had learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts. He raised the spyglass, its worn surface smooth against his calloused palm, and surveyed the landscape. There, a flash of pale silk against the red rocks, moving like a flag in the morning breeze. Jake adjusted his focus, years of tracking experience kicking in. The sand told a story, scattered footprints, erratic and deeply pressed, speaking of exhaustion and desperation. "Easy, boy," he murmured to Buck, steering him toward the tracks. Someone had been walking out here, someone who didn't know the desert. The footprints were small, likely a woman's, and recent, the sharp edges, not yet softened by wind. As they drew closer, Jake spotted more strips of silk tied to bushes along the way. Smart. Whoever she was, she'd had the presence of mind to mark her trail. But the patterns in the sand showed her path becoming more unstable, the steps weaving. Like a drunk's, the tracks led to a shallow cave in the red rocks. Jake dismounted, his boots crunching on the sandy gravel. His hand instinctively checked the revolver at his hip. 15 years of solitude had taught him caution, but as he approached the cave, what he saw stopped him cold. A woman lay crumpled just inside the entrance, her clothes caked with dust, skin angry red from sun exposure. Beside her lay a pair of expensive sandals, absurdly out of place in the harsh landscape. She wasn't moving. Jake knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. Her skin burned with fever under his touch. Without immediate help, she wouldn't last another hour in the rising heat. "Ma'am," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. No response. He studied her face, noting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter, now etched deeper by dehydration and exposure. This was no teenage runaway or lost hiker. This woman was probably around his age, and someone had left her out here to die. The thought stirred something in Jake that he'd thought long buried. Anger. He'd come to the desert to escape the darkness in people's hearts, but here it was again, written in the sand and sun-scorched skin of a stranger. Buck nickered softly, pawing the ground. The sun was rising fast, and with it, the temperature. Jake made his decision. Gently, he gathered, the unconscious woman in his arms, noting how light she felt despite her height. Years of working with injured horses had taught him how to lift without causing further harm. "It's all right," he found himself saying, though she couldn't hear him. "I've got you." The woman stirred slightly. A small sound escaping her cracked. Lips. Jake carried her to Buck, who stood steady as a rock while his master carefully mounted with his burden. The sandals and strips of silk he tucked into his saddlebag, evidence of her journey that might prove important later. As they rode toward his cabin, Jake felt the woman's fever burning through his shirt. 15 years he'd spent avoiding. People, healing from his own wounds in the solitude of the desert. Now, with this stranger in his arms, that carefully constructed isolation was about to shatter. He looked down at her face, peaceful despite the trauma written on her skin. Something about her stirred his protective instincts, awakening parts. Of himself, he'd thought as dead as the desert plants in drought. Whoever had left her out here had wanted her to disappear into the landscape, to become another desert ghost. Well, they'd picked the wrong piece of desert for that. Jake's cabin stood as a testament to 3 generations of ranching life, its weathered logs and solid foundations speaking of years of careful maintenance. As he guided Buck toward the front porch, the woman in his arms stirred again, her head rolling against his chest. Time was running short. He dismounted with practiced care, years of handling injured livestock making the awkward movement smoother than it should have been. The cabin's interior welcomed him with familiar shadows, everything exactly where he'd left it. His grandfather's medical kit on its shelf by the door, well stocked and ready as always. Jake laid her on his bed, the only proper one in the cabin. The quilt beneath her had been his grandmother's work, its patterns telling stories of cattle drives and desert blooms. He moved quickly now, gathering supplies, clean cloths, water, the medical kit with its mix of modern first aid supplies and his grandfather's old remedies. Her fever burned higher. Jake soaked a cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead, then began the careful process of checking for injuries. No broken bones, but her feet were torn up badly from walking barefoot. The sun had left its mark everywhere her clothes hadn't covered. "You're safe now," he found himself saying as he worked, his voice rough from disuse. "Whatever brought you. Out there it's over." The medical kit held everything he needed. His grandfather had insisted on being prepared for anything in the desert. Jake cleaned and bandaged her feet, applied burn ointment, and set up a makeshift IV from the kits. Emergency supplies, his military training, and years of ranch medicine flowing back like muscle memory. Hours passed as he tended to her. Outside, Buck whinnied, reminding Jake of his usual duties. He'd have to adapt his routine now, figure out how to care for both his ranch and this unexpected guest. The woman's breathing gradually steadied, her skin cooling under his touch. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed, deep and intelligent, despite the confusion, clouding them. "Where?" Her voice cracked. "You're safe," Jake repeated, reaching for a glass of water, small sips only. He helped her raise her head, watching as she followed his instruction with surprising control. When she'd drunk enough, she sank back against the pillow, her eyes clearer now as they took in her surroundings. "The desert," she whispered. "He left me. Rest," Jake cut in, not wanting her to relive it yet. "You need to recover your strength." She studied him with a gaze that seemed to look right through his carefully constructed walls. "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked him anything, since he'd had to explain himself to another person. He busied himself with checking her bandages while he considered his answer. "Because it was right," he said finally, his voice low. "Because the desert's got enough ghosts already." A small sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "I'm Sarah," she managed, her eyes starting to drift closed again. "Jake," he offered, watching as exhaustion pulled her back. "Under Jake Harrison." Once she was asleep again, Jake moved to his grandfather's old rocking chair by the window. The desert night spread out before him, stars emerging in the darkening sky. His quiet life had just become complicated, and part of him wondered if he should have taken her to town instead. But there was something about her, a strength he'd recognized even in her unconscious state. The desert had tried to claim her, and she'd fought back with everything she had. He respected that kind of courage. Jake's eyes fell on the framed photo near his bed, the only personal touch in the Spartan room. His grandfather stood proud in his ranch clothes, medical kit in hand, next to a young Jake in his Marine uniform. "Use what you know to help when you can, boy," the old man had always said. "Desert's hard enough without turning your back on those in need." Outside, an owl called into the gathering night. Jake settled deeper into the rocking chair, prepared for a long vigil. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, his path was clear. Sarah was under his protection, whether she knew it yet or not, and Jake Harrison had never been one to do things halfway. Dawn broke over the cabin, painting the room in soft golden light. Sarah woke to the gentle sound of wood being carved, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to match her heartbeat. Through half-opened eyes, she watched Jake working at a small table, his hands moving with surprising grace over a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a horse. She studied him without speaking, noting how his presence filled the room without dominating it. His movements were measured, careful, each stroke of the knife deliberate. A small collection of wooden figures lined the windowsill, horses in various poses, each one carved with obvious care and skill. "You're good at that," she said finally, her voice stronger than the day before. Jake's hands stilled, but he didn't startle. He'd probably known the moment she woke. "My grandfather taught me," he said, setting aside the unfinished horse. "Said idle hands make for restless thoughts." He moved to check her bandages, his touch professional but gentle. Sarah noticed how he telegraphed each movement, making sure she knew exactly what he was doing and why. It made her feel safe, respected, feelings that seemed foreign after James's betrayal. "The fever's broken," Jake said, helping her sit up against the pillows. "Think you can manage some breakfast?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of her hunger. She watched as Jake moved to the small kitchen area, his actions efficient and practiced. Soon, the cabin filled with the smell of coffee and something cooking. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, taking in the sparse but well-maintained interior. Everything had its place, speaking of years of solitary routine. 15 years, he replied, returning with a bowl of simple but hearty porridge. "Inherited it from my grandfather." Sarah accepted the bowl, noting the careful way he'd cooled it to just the right temperature. "You live here alone?" A shadow crossed his face. "By choice." The porridge was good, flavored with honey and what tasted like wild berries. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite as Jake returned to his carving. The silence between them felt comfortable, unforced. Through the window she could see a corral where several horses grazed peacefully. One raised its head, nickering softly. As Jake looked up, a small smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen, and something in Sarah's chest tightened at the sight. "Buck's getting impatient," Jake said, rising. "Need to tend to the horses. You should rest more." "I've rested enough," Sarah responded, stronger than she felt. "I can't just lie here while you can, and you will." His tone was firm but kind. "Desert took a lot out of you. Healing takes time." He gathered his carving tools carefully, cleaning each one before putting them away. The unfinished horse he left on the windowsill, its form emerging from the wood like a ghost taking shape. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her mind since she first woke. Jake paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. For a long moment he was silent, and Sarah thought he might not answer. "Some things don't need a reason," he said finally. "Some things are just right." After he left, Sarah sank back, against the pillows, her body reminding her that she wasn't as strong as she wanted to be. Her gaze drifted to the wooden horses on the windowsill, each one telling its own story through frozen motion. One reared up, defiant. Another seemed to be running, its wooden mane caught in an eternal wind. The unfinished one drew her eye. She could see what it would become. A horse standing guard, alert but peaceful, watching over its domain. Just like the man who was carving it, there was more here than first met the eye. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the morning sun warm her face. For the first time since James had left her in the desert, she felt something like peace. In this quiet cabin, with its carved horses and silent guardian, she'd found more than just rescue. She'd found a sanctuary. The old ranch bell rang out across the property, its urgent clanging cutting through the afternoon quiet. Sarah looked up from the book she'd found on Jake's shelf, her strength finally returning after 3 days of rest. Something was wrong. Jake burst through the door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by focused intensity. "Storm's coming, big one." He moved with purpose, gathering supplies and checking windows. "Need to get the horses secured." Without thinking, Sarah swung her legs off the bed. "I can help." Jake paused, studying her face. She expected him to refuse, to tell her she wasn't strong enough yet. Instead, he nodded once. "Put these on." He tossed her a pair of boots, old but sturdy. "Can't have you out there in bare feet." The boots were too big, but Sarah laced them tight. Outside, the sky had turned an ominous shade of copper, and the wind carried the sharp smell of electricity. Jake led her to the barn, where the horses were already growing restless. "Desert storms come fast and mean," he explained, showing her how to secure the barn doors. "That bell's been warning ranchers for 3 generations. My grandfather rigged it to ring when the wind hits a certain speed." The bell's clanging grew more insistent as the wind picked up. Jake worked quickly, directing Sarah with clear, simple instructions. Together, they brought in the horses, secured loose equipment, and reinforced the barn's weak spots with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," Jake observed, as Sarah expertly calmed a nervous mare. "I grew up in Kansas," she replied, stroking the horse's neck. "Different kind of storms, same kind of preparation." A massive thunderclap shook the barn. The horses stamped nervously, and Sarah felt Jake step closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. "We need to get inside," he said, his voice low and close to her ear. "Storm's almost here." They ran for the cabin, the wind trying to tear them apart. Jake's hand found her elbow, steadying her as they fought their way across the yard. The first huge drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dusty ground like bullets. Inside, Jake quickly lit the old oil lamps as darkness descended unnaturally early. The storm hit in earnest, rain hammering against the cabin's roof like 1,000 angry fists. Through the windows, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, transforming familiar shapes into alien silhouettes. "The horses?" Sarah asked, wringing water from her hair. "They'll be fine." Barnes stood through worse. Jake moved to stoke the wood stove, his movements sure even in the dim light. "You should get warm. There's dry clothes in the chest by the bed." Sarah changed into an old flannel shirt and jeans, both too big but wonderfully dry. When she emerged, Jake had coffee brewing on the stove, its rich aroma mixing with the smell of rain and wood smoke. Thunder crashed again, closer this time. Sarah jumped despite herself, and Jake's hand reached out instinctively, steadying her. The touch was brief but electric, sending warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee he handed her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the storm through the windows. The old cabin creaked and groaned, but held steady, an island of warmth in the chaos outside. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "for letting me help." Jake's eyes met hers. "In the lamplight, you didn't need my permission. You knew what needed doing and did it." The simple praise warmed her more than the coffee. After years of James subtly undermining her capabilities, Jake's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her competence felt like rain on parched earth. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, Sarah caught Jake watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. When darkness returned, neither of them spoke, but something had shifted in the air between them, as tangible as the electricity in the storm outside. The rain continued to fall, and the old ranch bell rang out its warning into the wild night. But here in the cabin, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of being valued for exactly who she was, no more, no less. Morning after the storm brought with it a freshly washed world. While Jake checked on the horses, Sarah moved around the cabin, stretching her recovering muscles. Her feet barely hurt now, and the sunburn had faded to a tender pink. She found herself straightening things, not out of obligation, but because it felt right to contribute. Behind a stack of books, something fluttered to the floor, a yellowed newspaper clipping. Sarah picked it up, intending to return it to its place, when a familiar face caught her eye. A younger Jake, in military dress blues, stood among a group of soldiers. The headline read, "Elite Marine Unit receives commendation for classified operation." "Didn't mean for you to find that." Sarah turned, startled. Jake stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She started to apologize, but something in his stance made her pause. He wasn't angry. He was wary, like a wild horse deciding whether to bolt. "You were a Marine," she said softly, not a question. Jake moved into the room, his boots leaving damp prints on the wooden floor. "Force Recon, 15 years, 4 months, 23 days. The precision of the count spoke volumes. Sarah waited, holding the fragile paper carefully. "Did 3 tours in Afghanistan," he continued, his voice distant. "2 in Iraq. Places they don't talk about on the news. Was good at what I did. 2. Good maybe." He took the clipping from her hands, looking at it like he was seeing ghosts. "That was the last mission. Can't tell you about it. Still classified. But after..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "After, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be around people. Everything was too loud, too bright, too much." Sarah thought about the careful way he moved, how he always seemed to know where everything and everyone was in a room, how he telegraphed his movements around her, not just out of courtesy, but from deep habit. "Your grandfather's cabin," he said, understanding dawning. "It was your sanctuary." Jake nodded, carefully refolding the clipping. "He left it to me, like he knew I'd need it someday. Out here, things make sense. Desert doesn't lie, doesn't play games. It just is what it is." Sarah thought about her own lies, the ones she'd told herself about her marriage, about James's late nights and secret phone calls. "Sometimes simple is better." Grandfather used to say that. Jake's eyes met hers, something vulnerable in their depths. "Said the desert strips away everything but truth. If you can face that truth, you can face anything." Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in golden beams. In the distance, a horse nickered, and the old ranch bell swayed silently in the morning breeze. "I told you my husband left me to die," Sarah said quietly. "But I haven't told you why." Jake remained still, offering her the same space she'd given him. 20 years of marriage, and he traded me in for a younger model, his assistant. The words should have hurt more, but they came out flat, matter of fact. He'd planned it all: the desert drive, the empty water bottle, the stolen phone, everything calculated to make me disappear. "What will you do now?" Jake's question held no judgment, no pity, just genuine interest. Sarah looked around the cabin, at the carved horses and worn books, at the medical kit that had saved her life. "I don't know yet, but I'm done living lies, done pretending things are fine when they're not." Jake moved to the window, his back to her. "Cabin's yours as long as you need it. No strings." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken things. Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the windowsill. "What if I don't want no strings?" The words came out before she could stop them, honest in a way that surprised even her. Jake turned, and in his eyes she saw the same raw truth she felt. They stood there, 2 broken people who'd found something unexpected in the desert's vast emptiness. The moment stretched, fragile as a spider's web in morning dew. Then Buck whinnied from the corral, breaking the spell. Jake cleared his throat, but his eyes never left hers. "Coffee's getting cold," he said softly. Sarah smiled, understanding everything he wasn't saying. "Can't have that." They moved to the kitchen together, the newspaper clipping forgotten on the windowsill. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, keeping their secret safe in its sun-baked embrace. The small TV in the corner of Jake's cabin rarely saw use, but this morning it flickered to life, bringing the outside world into their sanctuary. Sarah froze at the sight of James on the screen, his face a perfect mask of concern as he stood before a bank of microphones. "My wife has been missing for over a week now." His voice cracked with well-practiced emotion. "Sarah, if you're out there, please come home. Whatever made you leave, we can work it out." Jake's hand tightened on his coffee mug. "He's good. He's had practice," Sarah replied, watching her husband play the role of grieving spouse. 20 years of real estate taught him how to sell anything, even lies. The news report continued, showing pictures of Sarah from various charity events and real estate functions. Always smiling, always perfectly put together, a stranger's face now. Police say Mrs. Mitchell's cell phone and credit cards haven't been used since her disappearance, the reporter continued. Her husband reports she had been struggling with depression, leading authorities to fear. The TV went dark as Jake hit the power button. You don't need to hear that. Sarah stood, moving to the window where she could see the desert stretching endlessly. He's setting the stage, making sure everyone believes I either ran away or... She couldn't finish the sentence. There's a police report, Jake said quietly. Filed the same day he left you. Creates an alibi, makes him look concerned. You checked? Jake nodded. Had to know what we're dealing with. The we didn't escape Sarah's notice. She turned to face him. I should leave. I'm putting you at risk, involving you in this. No. The word came out firm, brooking no argument. Running now would only play into his hands. Jake moved to stand, beside her at the window. Besides, desert's the best place to hide something or someone. Been doing it myself for 15 years. A cloud of dust on the distant road caught their attention. Jake's posture changed instantly, the soldier in him coming to the surface. He grabbed his binoculars from their hook by the door. Police cruiser, he reported. County sheriff by the looks of it, probably checking remote properties. Sarah's heart raced. What do we do? We? Jake lowered the binoculars, giving her a steady look. We do nothing. You stay inside. I'll handle it. Before Sarah could protest, he was moving with military efficiency. He gathered the medical supplies by her bed, tucking them out of sight. Her borrowed clothes went into a chest. The books she'd been reading disappeared onto shelves. Jake, trust me, he said, his eyes meeting hers. I've got experience keeping things off the radar. The cruiser's dust cloud grew larger. Jake gave the cabin one last sweep, erasing all signs of Sarah's presence. Then he paused, face softening for a moment. Your choice, he said quietly. If you want to go with them, tell your story. I won't stop you. But if you stay... He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Sarah thought of James's performance on TV, of the careful groundwork he'd laid to discredit her story. Her word against his, and he held all the cards, their social connections, her depression, her unexplained disappearance. I'm staying, she said firmly. Jake nodded once, then guided her to his bedroom. Stay quiet. Let me handle this. Sarah watched through a crack in the door as Jake went outside to meet the approaching cruiser. He stood easily on his porch, every inch the solitary rancher, nothing about him suggesting he was hiding anything or anyone. The sheriff's voice drifted through the window. Checking all the remote properties, Mr. Harrison. Missing woman case. You seen anything unusual past week or so? Just the storm, Jake's voice came back, casual but respectful. Been pretty quiet otherwise. Papers rustled. Mind if we take a look around? Rather you didn't. Jake's tone stayed friendly but took on an edge of steel. Don't get many visitors. Out here for a reason. Like my privacy. A pause then. You'll let us know if you see anything. Always do, Sheriff. Good luck with your search. Sarah held her breath until the sound of the cruiser faded. When Jake returned, his face was grim. They'll be back. Man like your husband, he won't give up easy. What do we do? Jake's eyes met hers, and in them she saw not fear but determination. We prepare. And when he comes, because he will, we make sure the truth comes out on our terms. The desert wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the first hints of another storm brewing on the horizon. The desert's got its own language, Jake said, spreading an old map across the kitchen table. Dawn light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the weathered paper. You need to learn to read it if you're going to survive. Out here, Sarah leaned over the map, breathing in its musty scent of age and adventure. Jake's finger traced lines that meant nothing to her yet. Washes, game trails, hidden springs that had sustained generations of ranchers. Your husband won't expect you to know these things, he continued, his voice low and steady. That's our advantage. The morning was cool enough for riding, and Jake had decided it was time Sarah learned the lay of the land. She watched as he saddled buck and a gentle mare named Willow, his movements sure and practiced. "You ever rode before?" he asked, adjusting Willow's stirrups. "English style, at summer camp?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "Seems like another lifetime now." "Desert riding's different," Jake said, helping her mount. "You need to trust your horse. They know this land better than any map." The mare moved easily beneath her, and Sarah found herself remembering long-forgotten lessons. Jake rode beside, her teaching without seeming to teach, how to read the clouds, spot game trails, recognize plants that could help or harm. "See how the sage grows thicker there?" He pointed to a slight depression. "Means water runs through during storms. Good to know for survival, dangerous during flash floods." They rode higher, the desert spreading out below them like a painted canvas. Sarah saw it differently now, not as the hostile emptiness that had nearly claimed her life, but as a complex, living thing. "Over there," Jake gestured toward a distant rock formation. "There's a cave system. Goes back about 50 feet. Previous. Owner used it to hide cattle during rust wars. Could be useful if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. They were building her arsenal of knowledge, preparing for whatever might come. Near a hidden spring, they dismounted. Jake showed her how to find water by reading the landscape, how to purify it, how to cover her tracks if needed. His hands were gentle as he demonstrated each technique, and Sarah found herself watching them, strong, capable hands that had carved delicate wooden horses and saved her life. "You're good at this," he said suddenly, watching as she successfully started a small fire using his techniques. "Most city folks, they fight against the desert. You're learning to work with it." "Had a good teacher," Sarah replied, meeting his eyes across the flames. Something flickered there, intense as the fire between them. Jake looked away first, but Sarah saw the slight color in his cheeks. He busied himself with checking the horses while she doused the fire and erased all signs of their presence. Another skill he'd taught her. The ride back was quiet, comfortable. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. Sarah felt the day's lessons settling into her bones. Not just the survival skills, but something deeper. A sense of belonging she'd never felt in her carefully manicured suburban life. "I used to think the desert was empty," she said as they approached the cabin. "Now I see it's full of life, just hidden unless you know where to look." Jake helped her dismount, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary at her waist. "Lot of things are like that," he said softly, "hidden until someone takes the time to really see them." Their eyes met, and Sarah felt the truth of his words in every beat of her heart. She was learning to read not just the desert, but this man who'd saved her. His subtle expressions, the weight of his silences, the gentle strength that ran deeper than his military training. In the corral, Willow nickered softly to Buck. The horses moved together naturally, sharing water from the same trough. Sarah watched them, thinking how some partnerships were just meant to be, formed not by force, but by mutual understanding and trust. Behind her, Jake began his evening routine of caring for the horses. Sarah joined him without being asked, their movements synchronizing as naturally as breathing. Out here, under the vast desert sky, she was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone true to herself, someone worthy of the trust she saw in Jake's eyes. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a rare desert rain. Sarah sat on the porch, watching lightning dance across distant mountains, while Jake cleaned his grandfather's old revolver, a nightly ritual she'd come to find comforting. The metallic gleam caught her eye as he worked, but it was the worn military tags around his neck that drew her attention. He rarely wore them openly, but tonight they'd slipped free of his shirt as he worked. "You want to ask?" he said without looking up. "Have since you found that newspaper clipping?" Sarah watched another flash of lightning illuminate the desert. "Only if you want to tell me." Jake set the revolver aside, the tags clinking softly as he leaned back. "Force recons. A special kind of unit. We handled things that never made the official reports, missions that couldn't exist on paper." His voice was different now, deeper, weighted with memories. "Last mission went bad. Intel was wrong. We walked into a village that was supposed to be empty, except it wasn't. He touched the tags absently. There were children there. We didn't know until it was too late. Sarah felt the weight of his words, understanding now why he chose solitude, why the desert's emptiness brought him peace. The official report said we completed our objective, commendation ceremony and everything. His laugh held no humor. But some nights I still hear them. The children, the mothers. Can't wash that kind of thing away. Lightning flashed again, closer now. Sarah moved to sit beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching. My team, they handled it better, went on to other missions, other units. Me, he gestured to the desert darkness. Couldn't do it anymore, couldn't trust orders, couldn't trust myself. Applied for discharge the next day, and your grandfather's cabin was waiting, Sarah said softly. Jake nodded. He knew. Never said anything, just handed me the keys and said, "Desert's good for healing, boy. Takes everything down to bones and builds it back right." Thunder rolled across the land, and rain began to fall in earnest. They sat in silence, watching. The storm painted the desert in sheets of silver. "First year out here, I barely spoke to anyone," Jake continued. "Second year was a little better. By the 5th year, I could make supply runs to town without feeling like my skin was too tight. But I never," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "never felt right around people. Until now." The admission hung in the rain-heavy air between them. Sarah thought about her own scars, different from Jake's but just as deep. 20 years of slowly dying inside while maintaining a perfect facade. "When James left me in the desert," she said quietly, "I thought it was the end. But maybe—" She turned to face him, seeing her own truth reflected in his eyes. Maybe it was just the beginning. Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, rough palm against smooth skin. Sarah. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "We've both been hiding," she said. "You in the desert, me in a marriage that killed me bit by bit. But out here," she squeezed his hand, "out here, I feel real for the first time in years." The rain intensified, but neither of them moved to go inside. Jake's thumb traced circles on her palm, each touch sending warmth through her body. "I'm not an easy man," he said finally. "Got too many ghosts, too many broken pieces. Good thing I'm not looking for easy." Sarah moved closer until their shoulders touched. "I'm looking for real." Lightning split the sky, illuminating them for a brief moment. Two wounded souls, finding unexpected healing in each other's company. Jake's tags gleamed dully in the flash, no longer a burden of guilt, but a testament to survival. "When all this is over," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when your husband's lies come to light and you're free to go anywhere, what then?" Sarah watched the rain fall, thinking of the life she'd left behind. The hollow success, the empty luxury, the slow death of pretending. Then she looked at Jake, at the quiet strength in his face, at the way he'd taught her to read the desert's hidden language. "Maybe," she said softly, "I'm already where I need to be." The storm raged on, but in the shelter of the porch, two hearts began to heal, guided by the desert's ancient wisdom and the profound truth of second chances. Dawn painted the desert in watercolor hues, the sunrise softening the harsh landscape into something almost magical. Sarah stood at the edge of the garden Jake had helped her start, watching wildflowers sway in the morning breeze. She'd pressed one between the pages of her borrowed book yesterday, a desert marigold that had somehow flourished in this unforgiving soil. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Jake was returning from his morning ride, Buck moving with fluid grace beneath him. She watched him dismount, the easy strength in his movements making her heart skip. These past weeks had changed him, or maybe they'd changed each other. "Found something?" he called, leading Buck to the corral. "Thought you might want to see it." Sarah followed him to the barn, where he pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wooden box, weathered but intact. "Was checking the north boundary when I spotted this caught in some brush. Must have been uncovered by the last storm." The box opened with a gentle creak, revealing a collection of pressed flowers, decades old, but still holding their color. Beneath them lay a letter, the paper yellow with age. "My dearest Elizabeth," Sarah read aloud, "another season in this unforgiving land, and still these flowers bloom. Like my love for you, they persist despite all odds." She looked up at Jake. "It's beautiful. My grandmother's name was Elizabeth," Jake said softly. "Grandfather must have given this to her when they first settled here." Sarah touched the pressed flowers gently. "She kept them all these years. Some things are worth keeping." Jake's voice was closer now. She turned to find him standing near enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, catch the scent of leather and desert sage that always seemed to cling to him. "Jake!" His name came out as barely a whisper. His hand rose to her. Face, calloused fingers, feather-light against her cheek. Sarah leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of it. "Been fighting this," he admitted roughly. "Telling myself you deserve better than a broken man hiding in the desert." Sarah opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "And I've been telling myself you deserve better than a woman who let herself be fooled for 20 years. You survived," he said firmly. "Desert tried to kill you and you survived. That's not foolish, that's strength." The box of pressed flowers sat forgotten as Sarah raised her own hand to his face, tracing the line of his jaw. Jake went still under her touch, like a wild thing uncertain whether to flee or stay. "We've both survived," she whispered. "Maybe that's enough." The morning light filtered through the barn's high windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Time seemed to slow, stretch, crystallize around this moment. Jake's hand slid into her hair, gentle but sure. Sarah felt the last of her hesitation melt away as she rose up on her toes, meeting him halfway. Their first kiss tasted of coffee and sunrise, of new beginnings and ancient truths. It was both tender and fierce, speaking of all the words they hadn't said, all the pain they'd survived, all the hope they'd found in each other. Jake's arms wrapped around her, strong and protective, while Sarah's hands fisted in his shirt, holding on to this moment with everything she had. When they finally parted, they kept hold of each other, foreheads touching, sharing breath in the quiet morning light. Outside, a meadowlark called to its mate, its song carrying across the desert. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. Jake's thumb traced her bottom lip, his touch reverent. "Now we stop hiding. From this, from ourselves, from what's coming." She knew he meant James, the inevitable confrontation that loomed on their horizon. But here in the barn, with the scent of hay and leather around them, and the warmth of Jake's arms keeping her safe, tomorrow's battles seemed distant and manageable. "I'm not afraid," she realized aloud. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his face. "No," he agreed. "You're not. You never really were." He kissed her again, softer. "This time. That's what made me fall in love with you." The words, spoken so simply, filled something in Sarah that had been empty for longer than she could remember. She pulled him down for another kiss, pouring all her response into it, letting her actions speak the words her heart was still learning. To trust. Through the barn door, the desert stretched endless and beautiful, witness to their newfound joy, keeper of their blossoming love. The peace of their morning was shattered by the distant sound of tires on gravel. Jake heard it first, his body tensing mid-conversation. They'd been sharing coffee on the porch, Sarah laughing at his story about a stubborn calf when his military instincts kicked in. "Vehicle coming, not the sheriff's cruiser." His voice shifted to that controlled tone Sarah had come to recognize from their survival lessons. "Get inside." Through Jake's binoculars, they watched a sleek black SUV wind its way along the dusty road. Sarah's hands began to shake as she recognized the vehicle. "It's James's new Range Rover," she whispered. "He always said it was the perfect car for a successful real estate agent." "Image is everything." Jake's jaw tightened. "He's alone, must have followed up on the sheriff's report about remote properties." He turned to her, eyes intense. "Your choice, Sarah. We can face him, or I can send him away." Sarah looked around. The cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the carved horses on the windowsill, at the pressed wildflower in her book. She thought of the woman she'd been just weeks ago, perfectly coiffed, perfectly obedient, perfectly miserable. "I'm done running," she said firmly. "Done hiding." Jake nodded once, understanding in his eyes. "Stay behind me. Man leaves a woman to die once, no telling what else he's capable of." The SUV pulled up in a cloud of dust, its pristine black paint looking alien against the desert backdrop. James stepped out looking exactly as Sarah remembered. Expensive suit, carefully. Styled hair, practiced smile. The smile faltered when he saw Jake standing on the porch. "I'm looking for my wife," James called out, his voice carrying that smooth, professional tone he used for difficult clients. "The sheriff mentioned there was a property out here. I've been searching everywhere for her." "Have you?" Jake's voice was deceptively calm. "Searching everywhere except where you left her?" James's facade cracked for just a moment before he recovered. "I don't know what you're implying, but Sarah's been missing for weeks. She's been struggling with depression, and I'm very concerned." "Concerned enough to leave me with no water?" Sarah stepped out onto the porch, feeling Jake's solid presence beside her. "Concerned enough to steal my phone, my wallet, everything I could have used to survive." The color drained from James's face. "Sarah, but how am I alive?" She took another step forward, drawing strength from Jake's quiet support. "No thanks to you." James's eyes darted between them, calculating. Odds and angles like he did with every real estate deal. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket. "That would be a mistake," Jake said softly, and suddenly the soldier was there in his voice, in his stance. "A real big mistake." James's hand froze. Sarah saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the moderate morning temperature. "Sarah, honey, you're confused," he tried again. "Whatever this man has told you—" "I'm not confused," Sarah cut him off. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm seeing clearly. You left me to die, James. Left me like I was nothing, like 2 decades of marriage. Meant nothing. I have witnesses who saw how distraught you've been," James countered, his voice taking on an edge. "The police have documentation of your mental state, your instability, and I have this." Sarah pulled out her phone. Not her old one that James had stolen, but Jake's spare that they'd kept turned off until now. "Been recording since you drove up. Every word, James, every admission." The mask finally crumbled completely. James's face contorted with rage, and his hand shot into his jacket pocket, but Jake was faster, much faster. Before James could pull out whatever he was reaching for, Jake had crossed the distance between them, his movements fluid and deadly. "Like the lady said." Jake's voice was terrifyingly quiet as he held James's arm in a grip that made the other man gasp. "She's done running. Now real slow, you're going to take your hand out of that pocket. Then you and I are going to have a serious discussion about your future choices." The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. Not of James, not of the future, not of anything. She had found her strength in this harsh landscape, and more importantly, she had found her truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Jake held James in that implacable grip. With his free hand, Jake reached into James's jacket pocket and pulled out a small revolver, cheap and new, the kind bought in haste with bad intentions. "City boy bringing a gun to the desert," Jake said, his voice carrying that deadly calm Sarah had never heard before. "You have any idea how to use this? Or were you just planning to point and pray?" James struggled uselessly against Jake's hold. "You don't understand. I've built everything I have from nothing. I won't let her destroy it all with lies." "Lies?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Like the lies you told the police about my mental state, or the lies you told our friends about my disappearance." Jake cleared the revolver with practiced ease, letting the bullets fall into his palm before tossing the empty weapon aside. His grandfather's revolver still hung at his hip, untouched. He hadn't needed it. "Inside," Jake ordered, marching James toward the cabin. "Time we had a real conversation about consequences." In the cabin's main room, Jake forced James into a chair. Sarah watched her husband, a man she'd once loved, once trusted, seem to shrink in the face of real opposition. Without his practiced smile and smooth words, he looked smaller somehow. "Your fingerprints are on that gun," Sarah said quietly, "and we have the recording of everything you've said. One call to the sheriff changes your whole story." "You wouldn't," James spat, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "You'd never survive the scandal. All our friends, our social circle—" "You mean your friends? Your social circle?" Sarah moved closer, feeling no fear now. "The people you've been lying to about me for weeks? I think they'd be very interested in the truth." Thunder rumbled in the distance, another desert storm approaching. Through the window, Sarah could see dark clouds gathering, much like the day Jake had found her. "What do you want?" James asked finally, his voice taking on that negotiating tone she knew so well. "Money? Fine. Name your price, both of you." Jake's laugh was cold. "You still don't get it. This isn't a real estate deal you can smooth talk your way through." "Then what?" James looked between them, desperate now. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to look at me," Sarah said firmly. "Really look at me, James. I'm not the same woman you left to die out there. The desert burned away everything weak, everything false. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I'm not afraid of the truth." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white. In that brief flash, Sarah saw James's face change as reality finally sank in. He was looking at her like he'd never seen her before. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said, his voice hard as granite. "You're going to sign a confession. Everything. The abandonment, the false police report, the gun. Then you're going to go back to your perfect life and file for divorce. Sarah's terms, no negotiations. And if I don't?" Sarah held up the phone. "Then this recording goes to the sheriff, and the gun goes into evidence, and every carefully constructed lie you've built comes crashing down. Your choice." James looked at her with something like wonder and fear mixed together. "You've changed." "No," Sarah corrected him. "I've remembered who I was before you taught me to be small, before I started believing your lies about who I should be." Jake moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Outside, the storm broke, rain hammering against the cabin's roof. The sound reminded Sarah of that first storm she and Jake had weathered together. James's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't destroy everything I've built." "Like you tried to destroy me?" Sarah asked quietly. But there was no hatred in her voice now, only a calm certainty. "Sign the confession, James, then go build something new, something real this time." Jake produced paper and pen, his military precision evident in every detail of the confession he'd prepared. They watched as James signed, his hand shaking slightly. "The sheriff will keep a copy," Jake said. "Insurance. Step out of line again, try to twist the story, and it all comes out." When it was done, when James had been escorted back to his shiny SUV and sent away under the stormy sky, Sarah stood on the porch watching the dust of his departure fade into the rain. "You okay?" Jake asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Sarah reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. "I'm free," she said simply. And for the first time in 20 years, she truly was. The days following James's departure brought a strange kind of peace. Sarah found herself spending more time in the garden, documenting her desert observations in a leather-bound journal Jake had given her. Each entry was a testament to her new life. Sketches of wildlife, pressed flowers, notes about the changing light on distant mesas. One morning, she woke to find an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a set of divorce papers, already signed by James, along with documents for a generous settlement. A note in Jake's handwriting explained that his military buddy-turned-lawyer had handled everything, ensuring the terms were in Sarah's favor. "You didn't have to do this," she said when Jake came in from his morning ride. "Didn't do it for you," he replied, pouring coffee into their usual mugs. "Did it to make sure he couldn't change his mind, try to twist things around again." Sarah studied the papers, feeling the weight of the choice before her. The settlement would give her enough to start fresh anywhere she wanted. She could move to a city, restart her life, become anyone she chose to be. "My sister called," she said quietly. "Wants me to come stay with her in Seattle. Says she knows people who could help me get back on my feet." Jake's hands stilled on his coffee mug, but his voice remained steady. "Might be good for you. Cities have more opportunities than desert ranches." Sarah stood, moving to the window where the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and rose. Her journal lay open on the windowsill, its pages filled with her neat handwriting, observations about desert plants, sketches of Jake's carved horses, notes about the stars they'd watched together. "I used to think opportunities meant cocktail parties and charity galas," she mused. "Designer clothes and country club memberships, all those things that seemed so important in James's world." She turned to face Jake, seeing the careful neutrality in his expression. He was trying to give her space to choose, she realized, even if it meant choosing to leave. "But out here," she continued, gesturing to the desert beyond the window, "I've found something different. Something real, the opportunity to be myself without pretense or performance." Jake set down his coffee, moving to stand near her but not touching. "Desert's not for everyone," he said softly. "It's harsh, demanding, lonely sometimes." Sarah reached for his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers. "Is it lonely for you still?" His fingers tightened around hers. "Not anymore." She pulled her journal close with her free hand, opening to a page where she'd pressed the desert marigold from their first kiss. "I've been writing about more than just plants and weather," she admitted. "Been writing about how the desert changed." "Me? How you changed me?" Jake's thumb traced circles on her palm, sending warmth up her arm. "How's that?" "You showed me strength doesn't mean not being afraid. It means facing the fear and moving forward anyway." She met his eyes. "You taught me to trust myself again, to see beauty in harsh places, to find peace in silence." "Sarah." His voice was rough with emotion. "I don't want Seattle," she said firmly. "I don't want cities or cocktail parties or any of that old life. I want this." She gestured to the cabin, the desert, their joined hands. "I want mornings watching the sun paint the mesas. Want evenings learning to carve horses on the porch. Want to build something real here with you." Jake pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "You sure? Really sure?" Sarah smiled, thinking of how far she'd come from that desperate day in the desert. The woman James left to die out there wasn't sure of anything. But the woman you helped me become, she's never been more certain. Outside, a meadowlark called to its mate. The desert stretched endlessly before them, no longer. A place of fear, but a landscape of possibility. Sarah's journal lay open between them, its pages ready to record whatever story they would write together. "Then stay," Jake whispered against her hair. "Stay and help me make this desert bloom." Sarah's answer was in the way she melted into his embrace, in the tears that fell silently on his shirt, in the knowledge that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us home. Spring came to the desert in subtle waves of color. Sarah stood in their expanding garden, new tools gleaming in the morning sun as she worked the soil. Jake had surprised her with them last week. Not the basic implements she'd been using, but professional-grade equipment that spoke of permanence and future plans. "Garden's looking good," Jake said, coming up behind her. He'd been working with Buck in the corral, and the morning's exertion had left a healthy flush on his face. "Grandfather would have liked this. He always said the cabin needed a woman's touch." Sarah smiled, remembering the old photographs Jake had shown her of his grandparents. "Elizabeth's roses used to grow right here, didn't they?" "Yeah." Jake knelt beside her, helping to dig holes for the native plants they'd carefully selected. Desert roses, tough as nails, just like she was. They worked together in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized after months of sharing space. Sarah had learned that healing happened in these quiet moments, in shared tasks, in gentle touches, in the gradual building of something new. Had a call from town, Jake said finally, patting soil around a young sage plant. Miller's ranch is struggling, asked if I'd help train their new horses. Sarah looked up, knowing what this meant. Jake hadn't taken outside work since she'd arrived, hadn't ventured far from their sanctuary. You should do it, she said softly. You're the best horse trainer in 3 counties, according to Frank at the feed store. Jake's hands stilled in the dirt. Would mean being gone some days, few hours at a time. I know. Sarah touched his arm, feeling the tension there. And I'll be here when you get back. The desert's home now, remember? His eyes met hers, and she saw the lingering worry there, the soldier's instinct to protect, the man's fear of loss. But she also saw trust, growing stronger each day. Besides, she continued, gesturing to their garden, I've got plenty to keep me busy here. Think it's time we both spread our wings a little. The morning sun caught Jake's smile, turning it into something rare and precious. He pulled her close, not minding the dirt on their hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that still made her heart skip. Got another surprise for you, he said when they parted. Leading her to the barn, he opened the door with a flourish. Inside, a section had been cleared and transformed. A workbench held wood-carving tools, arranged with military precision. But these weren't Jake's usual implements. They were sized for smaller hands, their handles smooth and new. Thought maybe you'd like to learn, Jake said, suddenly shy. Noticed you watching when I carve. Figure we could do it together, evenings on the porch. Sarah ran her fingers over the tools, feeling the promise in them. Like the garden equipment, they spoke of permanence, of shared futures, of healing through creation. First lessons tonight, Jake continued. If you want. I want, Sarah said simply, leaning back against his chest as his arms came around her. Through the barn door, they could see their garden taking shape. Desert flowers and herbs mingling, with vegetables, wild and cultivated, growing together, like them, finding strength in the harmony of differences. A dove called from somewhere nearby, its mate answering from the cabin roof. Sarah thought about the woman she'd been just months, ego perfectly coiffed and perfectly empty. That woman would never have imagined finding peace in dirt-stained hands and honest work, in quiet evenings, learning to carve horses, in the simple truth of being loved for exactly who she was. You know, she said, picking up one of the new tools, I think I'd like to carve a mare and foal, something about new beginnings. Jake's kiss on her temple was gentle. Seems fitting. They walked back to the garden together, the morning sun warming their shoulders. There was work to be done, a life to be built, healing to continue. But they would do it together, under the vast desert sky that had brought them to each other. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jake's desk as he spread out the cabin's deed. Yellowed with age, but still crisp, preserved carefully by his grandfather. Sarah watched as he traced the property lines with his finger, just as he'd once traced them on horseback during her early days here. Never thought I'd be changing this, he said quietly. Always figured it would stay in my name until... He trailed off, but Sarah understood. Until he died alone out here, a hermit in his desert sanctuary. You don't have to do this, she said, though her heart beat faster at what the document represented. Jake looked up, his eyes holding that mixture of strength and vulnerability that still made her breath catch. Want to? Need to? He pulled out a fresh document, the new deed their lawyer had drawn up. Want everyone to know this is your home. 2. Legally, permanently. Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched the paper. After James's betrayal, she'd sworn she'd never let herself be legally bound to a man again. But this was different. This wasn't about possession or control. It was about building something together. Sign here, Jake said softly, offering her a pen. As she took it, his hand covered hers briefly. If you're sure. She was sure, had been since that morning in the garden when she'd chosen this life. Her signature flowed across the paper, strong and clear, her new name, her new identity, her new beginning. Jake signed next, his usually steady hand showing the slightest tremor. When it was done, they sat in silence for a moment, looking at their names together on the deed to their home. "Got something else for you," Jake said finally, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small wooden box, one of his own carvings, she realized, the wood polished to a soft glow. Inside lay a key on a leather cord, not new and shiny, but worn with age and use. "Grandfather's original key to the cabin," Jake explained. "He gave it to me when I was lost, trying to find my way back to myself. Now I'm giving it to you." Sarah lifted the key, feeling its weight, physical and symbolic. "Jake, you saved me too, you know," he said roughly. "Found me out here hiding from life. Made me remember there are things worth coming back for." Through the window, they could see their garden blooming, the horses grazing peacefully in the corral, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. Everything they'd built together in these past months. "I have something for you too," Sarah said, reaching for her journal. From between its pages, she pulled out a photograph. Not old, but new, taken just last week. It showed Jake teaching her to carve on the porch, his hands covering hers as she learned to guide the tools. The setting sun had caught them in its golden light, turning the moment into something magical. But it was their expressions that made the photo special, both of them utterly absorbed in the task, completely at peace in each other's presence. "Frank's wife took it when they came for dinner," Sarah explained. "She sent it over yesterday. Thought maybe it could go next to the photo of you and your grandfather." Jake took the photo with gentle hands, studying it with intense focus. "Perfect place for it," he said finally, his voice husky with emotion. They hung it together, the new photo beside the old one, past and present, legacy and future, all bound together in this cabin that had saved them both. Outside, a desert storm was building on the horizon, but they weren't worried. They'd weathered storms before, would weather more in the future. The cabin was strong, their foundations solid. "Think we should tell Frank and Betty they're invited." "To a wedding?" Jake asked casually, though his eyes were anything but casual as they met hers. Sarah's heart soared even as she kept her voice steady. "Out here? In the desert?" "Where else?" His smile was soft. "Desert's where we found each other. Seems right to make it official here too." Sarah stepped into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage that meant home. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. 1,000 times. Yes. The storm drew closer, but in their cabin, their shared home now, legally and in every other way, they were exactly where they needed to be. Two souls who had found each other in the vastness of the desert, building a future neither had imagined possible. 1 year later, the desert dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as Sarah stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Jake work with a young horse in the corral. Her carved mare and foal sat finished on the windowsill behind her, a testament to how far she'd come in a year of evening lessons. The Miller Ranch contract had turned into more. Word had spread about Jake's gift with troubled horses, and now people brought them from 3 states away. Sarah handled the business side, her natural organizational skills turning their small operation into something sustainable. But it was the garden that had truly transformed. What started as a few hardy plants had become a flourishing oasis, drawing hummingbirds and butterflies to their little piece of desert. Sarah's journal had evolved too, its careful observations catching the eye of a university researcher studying desert plant adaptation. "Looking awful thoughtful up there," Jake called from the corral, his voice carrying easily in the morning. Quiet. The young horse beside him had calmed considerably under his gentle guidance. "Just thinking about time," Sarah replied, lifting her coffee in greeting. 1 year ago today, you found me out there." She nodded toward the distant rocks, where her life had changed forever. Jake secured the horse and walked to the porch, taking the steps 2 at a time. His movement was easier now, the old tension largely gone from his shoulders. He took the coffee she offered, their fingers brushing in a gesture that still sent warmth through her body. "Best tracking I ever did," he said, pulling her close with his free arm. Their wedding rings caught the morning light, simple bands they'd exchanged 6 months ago in a ceremony right here on their land, surrounded by desert blooms and the people who'd become their chosen family. Frank and Betty from town had stood up for them, along with Miller and his wife, and even Jake's old military buddy who'd handled their legal work. It was small, perfect, and entirely them. "Got a surprise for you," Jake said now, setting down his coffee. He led her to the barn, where a new foal stood wobbly-legged beside its mother, one of their own mares, bred to a stallion from the Miller Ranch. "She came in the night," he explained. "Managed it all on her own, just like her mama." Sarah moved closer, admiring the foal's spirit as it tried to master its legs. "She's beautiful. She's yours," Jake said softly. "First of our own breeding program. Thought you should have the honor of naming her." Sarah watched the foal, thinking of everything the desert had taught her about strength and survival. "Phoenix," she said finally, "rising from the ashes of what was, becoming something new." Jake's arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned into his solid warmth. Perfect name. They stood together, watching the new life they'd helped create, surrounded by the life they'd built together. The garden flourished behind them. The cabin stood strong and welcoming, and in the distance the desert stretched endless and beautiful. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, his voice holding a hint of their old conversations about choices and futures. Sarah turned in his arms, looking up at the face she'd grown to love more with each passing day, the face that had first appeared to her, like a mirage when all hope seemed lost. "Only that we didn't find each other sooner," she said, rising up to kiss him softly. A meadowlark called from the garden, its mate answering from nearby. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and morning glory, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Another storm approaching, but they weren't afraid. They'd weather it together just as they'd weathered everything else. "I love you," Jake said simply, the words still carrying the weight of wonder, of gratitude, of a man who'd found his way back to life through love. "I love you too," Sarah replied, the words holding all the strength and certainty she'd found in this harsh but beautiful land. They stood together as the sun rose higher, casting their shadows long across the barn floor. The foal nursed. The horses nickered softly in their stalls, and life continued its gentle rhythm around them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch and talked about that first day, how close it had been, how many small miracles had brought them together. But mostly they talked about the future, about their plans for the ranch, about the life they were building. The desert had tried to take everything from Sarah, but instead it had given her everything she never knew she needed. A home, a purpose, a love as vast and deep as the land itself. And as the morning light painted their world in gold, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be, in this harsh but beautiful place, with this strong but gentle man, building a life as enduring as the desert itself.